Okay, so as much as the legislature controls our lives, there's probably a bigger element as far as the control that businesses face. Most people don't think the legislature controls our lives. Most people believe that we're still quite free in the United States to pretty much do what we want as long as we don't get crazy about it. But for businesses, there's a whole kind of side of law that is not covered by any of the three branches of government directly, and that is what's called administrative law. Sometimes it's called agencies or administrative agencies. Yeah, thanks. So here's the learning objectives the authors of the book want you to understand. I think it's funny they want you to understand the purpose served by federal agencies, but like probably the first one should be like understand what a federal agency is, but I don't know why they jumped straight to that. How the agencies are controlled, how they make rules and conduct hearings, and anyway, so that's the things they want you to learn in this chapter. So this kind of goes back to the Commerce Clause, which we've already learned about when we in the constitutional section. Okay. In essence, the Commerce Clause says that Congress has the power to regulate trade between the states and with foreign governments. We've already kind of talked at length about how that power has become more powerful over the years, mostly through judicial action, as Congress has attempted to take more power through the Commerce Clause, and people have sued. Ultimately, the courts have kind of sided with Congress and said they have pretty great latitude to make laws concerning commerce between the states. So here's the problem. The executive branch of the government, they have the job of executing the law or enforcing the law. Okay? But a lot of times the laws that Congress passes are very specialized. So specialized that most of the members of Congress don't fully understand all the ramifications of the law. If you think about areas like business and finance, people are specialists in that area, right? I mean, maybe some of you will become those sort of specialists if you go past here and get your MBAs and go work in finance for 20 years. Well, at that point, you start to know a lot about finance. And a member of Congress, like Rand Paul, who's a physician, he probably doesn't know as much as a person who has an MBA and has worked in banking for 20 years about finance. So Congress recognized at some point that they needed some specialized agencies that had some authority to make laws that govern very specific things. And that's where agencies come from. They derive their power from Congress, meaning an agency of the government can't exist without Congress giving them authority to exist. And the courts over the years have upheld the authority of Congress to create these agencies. And we'll talk about why the whole existence of agencies is sometimes considered controversial by some people. All right, that's a lot of text. Sorry about that. So there's two different classifications of the agencies that we have in our government. The first are called independent agencies, and the second are executive agencies. So executive agencies are those that report directly to the executive branch. Independent agencies report directly to Congress. Okay? That's the difference. So typically independent agencies are governed by a commission or a board of 5 to 7 members. Usually the way they're set up is that the President of the United States appoints the commissioners or the board members, and the Senate confirms that appointment. Okay? Again, that's to spread it between two branches of government so that they don't get too much power. Most of them have the statutory requirement to be bipartisan, meaning, so you notice there's always an odd number of members. And so most of the time they have a law that will say if there's 5 members, only no more than 3 may be from one party. Or if there's 7 members, no more than 4 may be from one party. That's meant to to say that the agency shouldn't be a political instrument. It should be an instrument for creating specialized rules and regulations for its area. It'll probably be partisan, right? You'll have one more of one party than the other. And usually the way they do their terms, they stagger the terms and they make them long terms, like 6-year terms. So that way no one president is going to be able to appoint all of the board members or all of the commissioners to one of these commissions. So these are the ones, you probably heard the names of some of them. The oldest one is called the Interstate Commerce Commission. That came about, I'd have to look in the book, but in the late 1800s. It's the first one that was created. So you think about it, we existed 100 years before they decided to create these. But as the U.S. grew, as more states were added to the Union, and Congress says we've got to get a handle. If we have responsibility for interstate commerce, maybe we need an agency that can make some rules and maybe recommend them to Congress to create laws of people who are experts in this field. That was the idea. Okay. Then the Federal Trade Commission came, Federal Communications Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission, National Labor Relations Board, Environmental Protection Agency. So you'll notice the pattern here. These all have to do with trade or commerce in some way. Okay. A lot of executive agencies have to do with law enforcement. Why? Well, because that's what the president's primary role is to enforce laws. Okay. Here's the problem. These agencies, as they get created, they have powers of all the branches. They get to create their own rules. They don't call them laws. They call them rules. But if someone creates a rule that says you can't transport raw milk that has not been pasteurized, across state lines for sale. So if I milk my cows here in Safford, I can't drive over to Verdun, New Mexico, or Lordsburg or Silver City and sell that milk to people. Does that have the force of law to me, even though it's just called a rule? Does it limit my rights as a citizen? Because that's what laws do, right? Absolutely. So this agency, without any legislative input other than they were created by the legislature and the legislature told them go forth and make these rules, they've now created a rule that has the force of law to me as a citizen. They have executive powers. They're the ones that enforce their own rules. Most of these agencies have an enforcement arm. They have, cops that work for them, okay? And they have judicial powers. If you don't like their rule, guess who you have to go to? To them. And you have to try to get them to change the rule. So now do you see why this starts to be kind of controversial? Does it seem to go against the whole makeup of what the original intent of the Constitution was, to split up these powers because it was too much power for any one group or individual to have? The argument is their powers are limited to a very narrow set of things, number one. And as we'll see in a minute, there are means by which people can challenge those powers. Anybody have any thoughts about this? What do you think? What do you think about a single agency having the power to create a rule, enforce the rule, and you have to go to their judge if you don't like the rule? Seems kind of dumb.
So you can't, let's say, break one of the rules, I can't go to a regular judge and say that's not constitutional.
Not first. You have to go to them first, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and exhaust all remedy through them. But let's say it takes you 3 years to work through their process of exhausting all remedy. Do you think that that's going to remove any but the most strident supporters of you? Just the cost of it, right? Of the legal battle fighting with them. And that's in effect what happens. It's pretty frustrating for people. All right. So to create an agency, Congress has to pass a law, legislation, that's a law, called an Enabling Act. So each agency that exists was created through the passage of legislation. The courts have actually thrown out some enabling acts. Thrown out's a strong word. They've gone back to Congress and said, this is too broad. You've given too much authority to this agency. It has to be sufficiently narrow. That's the word they use, so that Congress can say, this agency has a very specific job to manage interstate commerce, which I think still sounds quite broad, right? Yeah.
Did these include like the FDA?
Yes. So good. I thought I had a slide in there about executive agencies. So things like the Department of Justice. So there's all of the cabinet level agencies. The Department of Justice runs the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Homeland Security, which then runs things like Immigration and Naturalization Service, Immigration and Custom Enforcement, Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms, right? Again, the intent behind this is that the law is so specialized in these various areas that a single police force would probably have a hard time managing that. So instead, we're going to make a specialized police just for immigrations and customs issues, which I think makes some sense, actually. But again, they start making rules, like who they'll stop and who they won't stop, who they'll question and who they won't question, the process by which they do that. How many of you have ever rolled through an immigration checkpoint? I have. How many of you have thought, this seems kind of Gestapo, like stopping me as I'm driving down the road? When they go, what do they say to you when you go through one of those checkpoints? Often they just wave you through, or if they talk to you, what do they say? Do you have fruit? Sometimes they ask if you're transporting fruit, or is everybody in the vehicle an American citizen? Do you think they're listening to your answer, or are they listening to the way you speak when you answer them? I have a family member who works for them, and he says, here's what they're doing. Number one, they're listening to see if you have an accent. I'm like, wait a minute, is that a probable cause issue if I have an accent, or what? And they're looking at you. Do you look like you belong here? That sounds a lot like saying, do you look white, doesn't it? Number two, they're looking in your vehicle. Remember that the Fifth Amendment provisions don't apply to things in plain view, or Fourth and Fifth Amendments, right? So if you got a kilo of Coke sitting on your back seat or something, so I suggest you put that under a jacket, all right? But if you have that sitting there, it's in plain view, that would give them a reason to search you, right? So they're looking for a reason to search you or to go deeper. So if I roll through there looking like me, talking like me, most likely they're just going to be like, have a good day, right? But if Angel rolls through there and you talk to him and you have a little bit of an accent, and they're going to say, are you an American citizen? And your answer is, you're an American citizen, right? Might they ask you a couple more questions? Like, where are you headed? Where are you coming from? And you're like, I'm coming from Mexico because I live in Mexico. Right? And they'll be like, I thought you said you're an American citizen. I am. What's that? Okay, but you grew up in Mexico, right? So it's not uncommon for you to drive home and see family or friends that live there still? Yeah. Have you ever had a problem or not really? Have you ever been asked to present something to demonstrate that you're an American citizen? They've asked to see an ID? Okay. I've never been asked to see an ID at an immigration checkpoint. Well, at the border, yes. I'm talking about the ones that are wholly in United States territory. And I'll be honest with you, can you tell? I have a little problem with the process of stopping people traveling from America to America and questioning them. I do, from a civil liberty sort of standpoint.
I just have a question I was kind of curious about. When you're talking about this, does the law of the Fifth Amendment and all that stuff, like search the car, does that still apply to even to people that aren't citizens of the U.S.? So, like, let's say that someone was in here illegally, do all of their rights still apply? Like, not being able to search their car, even though without a warrant, does that all still apply to the non-citizens?
Well, so if you're here illegally, and I know that you're here illegally, it doesn't apply now. Why? Because you're breaking the law. So if I catch you in the act of breaking the law, I can search you, okay? But if I think you might not be, that's not enough. That doesn't breach that sort of burden of, like, again, what's the probable cause? I have an accent, my skin is dark, that's not enough. And that's probably reasonable that it's not enough, right? There are plenty of Americans with dark skin and with accents. And the last thing we want to do is say the fact that you have dark skin and an accent means we have probable cause now to search you and you don't get the same rights as somebody else. That's crazy. So the threshold is, are they breaking a law? If I catch you breaking the law, right? If I observe you, if a police officer observes you selling drugs to somebody, they can search you now, right? They saw it with their own eyes. The question is, what if somebody else says, I observed him, right? Now we're back to Reading versus Safford Unified School District. Someone else says they saw her selling drugs, and the court said a strip search was too invasive because they didn't have sufficient reason to move forward. Anyway, there's a fine line, right? It's kind of like anything else in life where there's like, this is clearly a violation of someone's rights and this is clearly not. And then there's this really nebulous area in the middle where it's like hard to know, is this okay or isn't it? And a lot of times good cops doing the best they can are having to make this decision with 3 seconds to think about it. And you know, I always think it's unfair that the courts get all this time to sort of weigh all the issues, and then everybody turns on the cop and says, you see? And honestly, sometimes a police officer is just like, I had 5 seconds to decide. Or in the case of shootings, I had half a second to decide whether I was going to let them kill the other people or me, or I was going to do something about it. Anyway, all right. So this is how agencies are created. They're created through an enabling act. The enabling act has to be sufficiently narrow, and sufficiently narrow to the courts is probably broader than what you or I would think, okay? Because it has to be broad enough to let them work, right? So that's challenging sometimes. All right, so here's how you control the agencies then. So the executive branch gets to control their leadership, right? The president gets to appoint the commissioners of the independent agencies, and for the executive agencies, it's even a much more. So executive agencies, they only have like one leader, right? Like the Secretary of Homeland Security, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, not a commission. And so the executive agencies are usually more partisan than the independent agencies, or that's kind of the intent, right? The law enforcement agent, the president, gets to control who his law enforcement leadership is, okay? And the executive branch has control over the money that flows to its own agencies. And in the case of executive agencies, the executive branch has power through executive orders. In essence saying, hey, Bureau of Land Management, we're going to allow people to carry, citizens to carry firearms on BLM land, or we're not going to allow that, which really means we're going to enforce or not enforce how we feel about that. Can you carry a gun on BLM land right now? Bureau of Land Management? Yeah. The vast majority of land around this area belongs to the BLM, which means it belongs to the federal government, which means it belongs to you, Mr. and Miss Taxpayer. Congratulations. You can go, I don't know if Red Knolls is BLM or if it might be state trust land or Forest Service. That's the 3 types we have most of the public property around here is. This one shouldn't be overlooked, right? Think about what the power of the purse means to you guys. Some of you probably still have parents who help you out in some way, pay for your cell phone, occasionally put gas in your car, I don't know, whatever, right? Others, maybe not at all, right? It depends. There is a degree of independence when your parents don't pay for anything that's not there if your parents even pay for one little thing. Why? Because theoretically, they could press that power if pushed to do so. You want to have your phone? Then I need you to do this, right? Hopefully you don't have that relationship with your parents where they're like threatening to take things away from you because you're grown adults. But being college age kind of is a strange land of being a grown adult, but having like a foot still back in kid world. And it's, you're not kids anymore, but there's still like a toe back in there. And apparently, and sometimes, so think of that as like, again, hey, agency, do you want to continue to function? Then you're going to be nice, or the president's going to cut your budget. And not just the president, but there's often several layers of people below him in the Office of Management and Budget that can make your life difficult if you don't go down that road. The legislature has control over agencies because they're the ones who write the Enabling Act that limit the scope of the agency's power, and legislation can be changed. Happens all the time, right? It happens when a new election shifts the power and they go back and they rewrite legislation and say, we're going to keep these aspects of the law, but we're going to change these aspects of it. So that gives them some control over agencies. And remember, the way our legislature functions, where we have a House where people are elected to 2 years by popular vote, and then we have a Senate where people are elected to 6-year terms, mostly by popular vote now, not mostly, by popular vote now. Originally, that wasn't the case, right? Originally, the states chose how they chose, or the states designated the way they chose their senators. And so different states, in some states, they were actually elected by the state House of Representatives, and not by the people directly. And so this makes the agencies answerable to the people to a degree, but not fully. And that's the way it was intended to be. And then the judicial branch has the ability to hear claims that an agency overstepped its bounds. So if an agency goes too far and somebody then goes to the agency and says, I think you've gone too far, and the agency says, I don't think we have, and they appeal within the agency to the highest authority within the agency, then finally it can go to court. And then the courts can rule on that. And they have at times said, whoa, this agency did go way too far. Although that's not common. Usually the courts side with the agencies as long as they're following their own rules and following the rules that they're supposed to follow. And that's what this says. Judicial review only comes into play after administrative review has been attempted. Has been attempted. My bad. So Congress realized in the 1940s that these enabling acts were kind of getting all over the place. So they created a single law called the Administrative Procedures Act that detailed how the federal agencies would function, gave rules saying this is how they have to, and especially how they would function as it relates to deciding cases that come before them, issuing regulations or rules, and administration, how they would run it. So they decided there should be some uniformity in the way the agencies run, which probably is a good thing, right? So that people dealing with them will have a sense of these are the rules they have to abide by. And there's also, I forget the name of it, but there is, what happens a lot of times is each state passes its own laws. So sometimes somebody like in one state will draft legislation for how the state agencies have to answer to the governor of the state and to the legislature of the state. And then other states will say, hey, that's a really good law, and they'll kind of like steal their law. And so sometimes you'll have a piece of state regulation that becomes like a model state regulation that multiple states will kind of adopt. And I forget the name of it, but there is something like the Administrative Procedures Act at the state level that is the same in 29 different states. They've all adopted it. But that means that 31 haven't. That's the weird thing about the United States, right? Arizona, you can carry a firearm concealed with no license at all, and you cross the border into New Mexico, and they say, no, you've got to have a concealed carry license. And then you cross the border into New Jersey, and they say you can't carry concealed unless you have a very special, license that only like police officers and private detectives, a very narrow set of people can have. I've heard foreigners joke that they wonder if like at the border of each state, if there's like a little stand with brochures that you could get that like tell you what's legal and what's illegal in each state, because they think it's the weirdest thing that in this big country, different things are legal in one state and legal in another. So the most model legislation we have for administrative procedures at the state level has only been adopted by 29 of the states. 31 do it their own way, although it's quite similar. All right. So this is where it becomes an issue for businesses. Any of you have hopes of starting your own business someday? A couple of you? Any of you mind sharing what you think you'd like to do at some point? Do you have an idea? Yeah? Reed? Right, we've talked about this, yeah. Okay, so Reed sees a market. He sees a lot of guys, right, that with chiropractic licenses that don't want to run the business of being a chiropractor. And if they could find somebody who would manage that and pay them a salary, they'd probably jump at that rather than having to run their own business and struggle with all the business side. So he's like, okay, I have the business knowledge, grew up around chiropractic. I think I could do this, right? So it's a great idea. Are there regulations for chiropractors that they have to follow at the state level? Any federal level, or is it all done at the state board? Okay. And so is there paperwork they have to file? Yeah, right? Probably a ridiculous amount, at least to get started. Do they have to submit to inspections, do you know? They could be audited. Okay. And so I will tell you, like here at the college, this paperwork and inspection burden that's placed on us by the state probably requires $10 to 12 full-time people that we wouldn't have hired, except we have to make sure that we're audit ready and that we're compliant with state and federal guidelines. So if you think about that, in a place that has 200 employees, 12 people represents what? Something like 6% of our workforce. 12 full-time positions here at the college probably cost the college something like $1 million a year. So that's a significant burden, right? Now, would we still keep our books even if we didn't have financial auditors? We would. But we probably wouldn't have a team of 10 people doing it. We'd probably do it with a team of 6 or 7 people. Would we still try to, manage our financial aid? Of course we would. But because of the fiscal or the financial, the regulations for financial aid, the federal regulations, we have to have a bigger team to manage that process. Okay. Who else had a hand up for Tricia? Okay. So bakery and catering service would fall under some city regulations or county regulations for health code and stuff like that. And you wouldn't have a lot of other regulations, luckily. That'd be nice. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay. I don't know what regulations that would fall under. I'm assuming there'd probably be some state regulation, but it would probably depend on what services you offered as well. Yeah. Denny?
It's not really your idea of a business, but flipping houses.
Okay. That actually has a lot of state regulation with real estate. So anybody else have one? I saw yours, but retail? Are you going to be like retail like your family or something different? No? It does. It's terrible. You're open when everybody else is off. Want to go to the lake? No. To be at my business. Yeah.
Teaching guitar,
Okay. So that would probably have fairly minimal regulation, actually, which is, what's interesting to me that's like such a regulated industry is cosmetology, right? You got to have a license given by the state with so many hours of training. You're a licensed cosmetologist, right? You had to go, or you were. You had to go to cosmetology school and take a test and get a license from the state. Yeah. So I can do people's taxes with no license at all. But to cut someone's hair, you got to have a license. And the argument is that there is a sort of a safety issue there, right? And it's, what's that? Yeah. It's, maybe not in haircutting as much as in nails and some other things where you could actually give somebody an illness or something.
Yeah, like,
Cut someone's ear off.
I want to cut my hair, I have a friend that cuts my hair, and she said that she, like, has to show the people every time that they're changing the straight razor or whatever, because if you know it's illegal, you can get in super trouble for that. That's weird, huh?
Well,
They have to show you, like, this is a new one that's open and forever. If not, you can, like, press charges.
be like, you used a straight razor that was used before. All right. I understand though, dude. Someday when you're married and you're in the shower and you grab a razor and you find out your wife shaved her legs with your face razor, that's not good. That thing's so dull it'll rip your flesh off. I think leg hairs must be stubborn. I don't know. So these are the administrative burdens put on businesses, and my point of all that is to say these can be significant, to the point where sometimes businesses have gone out of business because of their inability to pay the cost of the administrative burden. And the nature of the business matters. Some have far more administrative burdens than others, and so they have to price that in. Mining, if you want to start a little mining company, the MSHA training and the MSHA licensing is incredibly expensive, and that's why it's mostly big players that are in the industry. You think Freeport-McMoRan Copper and Gold, who owns the Morenci and Safford mines here, they bought those mines from Phelps Dodge. Phelps Dodge had been here since the 60s or 70s. And when they bought that from them, they paid mostly cash, billions of dollars. They were that big that they could just sort of plunk down $1 billion. Like, here you go. Right? And so because mining is so expensive because of all the federal regulation, usually the smaller players have a hard time competing in that industry. All right. So here's how judicial review works. First thing you have to do, Kuipo, is exhaust all your administrative remedies, which means you have to go to the administrative agency, the person who made the law, and the person who arrested you for breaking the law. You have to go to them and say, excuse me, sir, I don't think your law is right. Sorry, it's not a law, it's a rule or a regulation. I don't think it's right. Why don't you think it's right? Because it was really hard on my family. Well, too bad. And then you go up their process, and once you've exhausted that, then you can take them to court. And these are your strategies for obtaining judicial review. In other words, for getting the courts to actually listen to you. All right? You have to argue that their law was either, A, not in accordance with the agency's scope of authority. So in essence, what you would have to do is study their enabling act and then say, hey, this rule you made is outside of the scope of what that enabling act allows you to do. This is not terribly successful most of the time, right? You'd have to have really solid factual basis for this to work. Number two, you could say it's not in accordance with the U.S. Constitution, all right, or the Administrative Procedures Act. So there's a law that Congress passed that says how you have to function and you're not functioning according to it. Or there's a little thing called the United States Constitution and you're not functioning in accordance with that. That's the second argument you could make. Third, you're not in accordance with a substantial evidence test. Well, what the freak does that mean? So the substantial evidence test means if you're going to make a rule that affects me, you have to have substantial evidence to show that that rule is effective for something. So you can't just make a rule because you want to, right? So here's an example. If the Environmental Protection Agency says no fishing is allowed in these waters because we have an endangered frog that lives there, they have to be able to show substantial evidence that fishing will harm the population of that frog. Maybe fishing will help it, maybe by removing the natural predators of the frog. So they can't just make a rule without doing a study that shows, look, we've seen that fishing depletes this type of fish and this type of fish gets fed on by the larval stage or whatever, right? So this is probably one of the more successful ways of challenging agency action is substantial evidence. Why? Because think about it, the people who work at agencies, especially at the lower levels, if you work for the Environmental Protection Agency, you're probably an environmentalist at heart. That's why you took that job, right? And so oftentimes the people at these lower levels, the enforcers, they have an axe to grind. They have something that has special meaning to them, and they will enforce things unevenly. And so oftentimes you can challenge them on that basis. Right? It's usually at the local level. Some local game warden is sort of taking an agency rule and running with it. And you can say, look, there's no evidence to say that what you're saying we have to do is really going to help or change anything. This is similar to it, unwarranted by the facts. Instead of it being science-based, this might be, it's based on observation or other things. And the last one is the arbitrary, capricious, or abuse of discretion, which is, again, very similar. Okay? So these last three all have to do with you can't just make a rule because you want to make a rule. There's got to be evidence behind it, and then you can't just enforce it any way you want to. There's got to be, you've got to enforce it according to the law and the rules that you make. And the other thing that's not on here, interestingly, is that the agency will set its own rules. They'll usually have internal documents saying this is how we will enforce these things. If they're not following their own procedures, you can also challenge that. You can say, look, your own rules say that you're supposed to do it this way and you're doing it this way. So those are all the ways you kind of challenge it at the court. So that's all I have for administrative law. Remember, if you haven't done it yet, that the questions, the 5 questions are due tonight. And any homework from Chapter 4, that was the case study. Some of you have not turned that in yet, some have already. That's also due today. So you want to make sure you get that done. Any questions or anything else? I know the long lectures aren't always the funnest thing, but it's an effective way to get a big bunch of information across.